Welcome, everybody. My name's Mukesh Bhatt. I am currently based in London. And the first thing I need to point out is this is meant to be an interactive lecture and workshop type thing. I will stop screen sharing between sections so that we can talk to each other. Okay, I'd first like to thank Daniela De Paulis for the inspiration for this project and to actually give me the opportunity for this workshop. It's an absolutely amazing project that I'm proud to be involved with and have been for some time. So without sparing her blushes, thank you very much, Daniela. My title slide is, of course, the After First Contact, Meeting the Cosmic In-Law. Now, please note that what I'm actually saying here is from a pseudo or quasi-legal perspective. In effect, we don't really have any laws that operate in outer space or about other cultures, but that's going to be part of the discussion that we go into. So can we learn anything from other cultural contacts in the past on Earth? Do we know anything about who's actually going to come and visit, if they come to visit, or are we visiting? And what will we say once we've actually received a message or otherwise? Do be aware that we are assuming for this workshop that we have deciphered any message that we have received. So the first question is, what are we going to do about it? This slide basically suggests a description of what we're likely to be talking about. And for the first part, what I'm going to present here is a video from the YouTube websites asking you what we have assumed. So I'd like you to watch this. I will then stop screen sharing for a while so you can give us some answers, and we will then go further on with this. So what I'd like to know from the people who are at this workshop is, what do you think that was, and what was it trying to tell you, and what assumptions did you actually make in trying to interpret what was going on? Daniela, would you like to start on this?
I know it's probably not the correct answer, but is some deity in some Indian religion. I'm sorry, I'm not very specific, but
first thing is,
on top of my head, what I am thinking of.
Right. First thing is, there are no such thing as right answers or wrong answers. So there's absolutely no reason to say yes or no. Okay, thank you for that. I think we've got communication using dance as a medium. And somebody has basically said, our visitors will be from Thailand, or at least we will not be able to communicate with them. That's interesting. The next one, isn't that Kali praying to the heavens? Okay, central floating image had a human figure included in the blob. Dance and music as a way to show humanity's place in the universe. Right, remember what this workshop is about is contact with other cultures and how you interpret the other culture. What we saw there, what we have seen there, is basically Indonesian shadow puppet theater, presenting a myth from the Hindu epics. Now, that myth basically is that of the Ramayana, that's fine, but you did not see any portions of that particular epic. What you saw there what you see here is the creation of the universe. And what you've got in the middle is a human figure, so thank you very much. However, I'd like to point out that the human figure is not so much a human figure as a deity in a boat on the waters of creation. And yet at the back of this, what we also have is an image of the universe as we know it now, as opposed to 2000 years or more ago. So the question here is, what have we assumed? You've assumed, as far as I can tell from the chat, that we are trying to communicate something to dance and music. But what about the content of the message? Have we assumed anything there? Have we understood anything there at all? So what I'm going to do now is go on to think about where it is and what it is that we're trying to assume. In the West, in European culture, we have people like Plato, also around about 2,500 years ago, who described something like Plato's cave, which is very similar to the shadow puppetry of the Indonesian cultures. There's a bunch of people who are chained, who cannot see outside the cave, but who can only see shadows cast by the fire on a wall. And they are trying to work out who these people are. In modern times, we've got a lawyer named Rawls, who basically talks about a veil of ignorance. In other words, if we can't see the people, if we have no communication with them, what sort of assumption can we make? This is something that you will find many cultures do in marriage systems, where in their marriage rituals, where basically the groom and bride are often separated by some sort of veil, especially in cultures where the groom and bride have not met previously. Okay. So what this actually tells us so far is that we need some way of predicting the other person or other entity or whatever it is. This is what psychologists call theory of mind. And if and when we reply to any such message, our reply will give away our own theory of mind and our desires, our assumptions, capabilities, and a whole host of other information that maybe we want to give away or maybe we don't. Right? Now, very quickly, the Americans provided a field guide to aliens for us.
If you wanted to study how aliens might think, but you didn't have the ability to travel light years into space to find them, where would you look? For scientist Dominic Civitilli, the answer is under the sea.
It feels like being on some alien planet, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where you're just floating among this green haze, and with how dark it is, and with how cold it is, and then
so there we have aliens on Earth, mainly ones we can't communicate with. What I would like to underline here is that when we create a theory of mind to predict another person's actions or another entity's activities and understanding, or responses, we are often working with our own preconceptions and biases. So this is something to be very careful about, particularly when we get a message, whether it is from a fellow human being or whether it's from somebody or something on another planet. So where do we go from there? Remember, we've received a message. Why should we initiate or continue contact? Now I'm going to stop sharing again, and I would really like it if people started interacting and providing some answers. So can you think of any ways or reasons why we should initiate or continue contact, particularly with extraterrestrial entities? Right, who's going to go first this time?
I can start, Mukesh. As we know, there is quite a strong controversy about communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence, especially messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. So it's interesting to see how the cultural climate has changed since the 70s, when Carl Sagan and Frank Drake were sending these messages into outer space through radio waves or other spacecraft. So now we are much more conservative in this respect. And there is a general climate of caution around messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. So it would be interesting to also see what people here think. Personally, I've been reading about pros and cons, and I haven't made up my idea yet, but I think if they are extremely advanced technically, they will already know about our existence through not just through radio waves, but also from other sources that we emit. Life itself is a message. The fact that we live, the biology on Earth already creates some signatures that can be detected from another planet if they have sophisticated enough instruments. So this is my point of view. Intelligent life, of course, is different from biological life only. So that would require also the ability to detect signatures of, for example, technology or other forms that can indicate that a species is somehow using intentional instruments to live and flourish, like, for example, humanity.
That's absolutely wonderful. It's a great overview. And I would ask, when we're being cautious, is that perhaps an example of extreme paranoia, or is it just us being sensible? Also, in assuming intentions, in saying that you want to talk about their intentions, what have you assumed about them? And that is one of the basic questions when we try and interpret or decipher any message at all. And that is a problem with us on Earth between two humans, never mind between humans and other species or extraterrestrial entities. Now, in the chat, we've got a number of sort of suggestions. The main ones are to exchange knowledge, to understand technology and intentions, but that is at the heart of our question. What are the assumptions we're making in order to understand something? There are a number of different sort of situations where people want to work out whether they're hostile or otherwise, whether there's knowledge out there that we don't know about or won't admit. Of course, a lot of people are also talking about the technological limitations about whether we can communicate or not. However, this is very much something that I'm going to basically point out to the people who are putting these technological constraints in. We have assumed that we have received a message and that we have deciphered it. We are not in a discussion about what the message is or what it is, how we understand it. We are just assuming that. That is our basic assumption for this talk, And it is something that we need to recognize so that we can discuss what comes after. Yeah. So I hope people recognize that. And thank you for pointing out that Getting to Know You is the song from The King and I. I'm aware of that, and not The Sound of Music. But this is what Google comes up with when you try and actually sort of pin things down. And it turns out that by mixing the two films, King and I and The Sound of Music, it actually gave a better reading, as far as I'm concerned, of the sort of assumptions that we are making, even in the chat and even in trying to interpret the images that I'm putting up on screen here. Yeah. So I'm going to go back to sharing, unless there's any other comments that are particularly specific or important. Nobody wants to turn on their mic and speak to us, so okay.
I'd like to say something. It seems to me like this discussion is turning into kind of a sociological, theoretical discussion.
Yep.
And I think if you start dissecting away, one, the means of what this message came to us, I mean, was it what, telepathic? Are you assuming some kind of how did we receive this message? Because that right there is an initial clue as to the whole concept of how that civilization functions, its potential intentions, and also I think the irrationality of it. I mean, if this particular culture has technology, which I will assume it would, because the only means that we can even conceive now receiving a message from another terrestrial
Yep.
civilization,
Okay.
is through radio or light means. Now that requires technology. Now,
Right,
so if you-
absolutely. I'm going to actually point out that we are prefiguring a part of a discussion that I haven't reached yet. And
okay,
we are
well-
not discussing the technology of the aliens or the like until such time as we decide whether we want to respond or not.
Well,
So I'm perfectly happy to go through that, but however, if you could be patient a little bit rather than taking in a direction that this particular talk isn't meant to actually address.
well, okay, I understand now your purpose of the discussion, and I just think that it seems like I said, theoretical, sociological type of interaction, and not really.
Well, can I
anything to
point
do
out,
with
it's
that.
completely theoretical on the grounds that we have no aliens that we're actually talking to.
Well, obviously.
Yeah. So thank you. Right. In terms of actually why initiate contact or continue contact, here is a selection of things that humans on Earth at least do if they want to contact, talk to other people, if they received a message or if they want to send out a message. Right? That's quite a long list that I've found, but I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that there are other ideas and other reasons for continuing contact or initiating contact. Is there anybody who actually wants to add to these, or do you think this is a complete list?
Okay, so I think it would be great to just go with you through each of these, because I think not everyone is familiar with each of these items.
Yeah, absolutely. There's far too many to actually discuss in detail anyway, which is unfortunately one of the problems with a time-limited presentation. So the question that I keep coming back to is, should we respond, given that we have no theory of mind and we don't actually know how or why we should respond? But similarly, the question ends up being, who responds? Not just how we respond. And at least one of the, we have already mentioned things like technological limitations. We've already mentioned things like the limitations to our understanding of extraterrestrial entities or even species on Earth. So the first question is, are we actually talking to an entire planet? Because that seems to be the sort of basic assumption that everybody makes. And yet here on Earth, we do not have a single planet. We actually have many, many countries, many, many ideologies, many religions, many cultures. We have multiple landing sites. And when we respond, should we respond as we are, or and provide, say, in English or Mandarin Chinese or otherwise, or should we attempt to communicate with them in whatever communication medium they presented with us? So this is part of the messaging extraterrestrial intelligence protocols. There are questions that you go put together, and one of the questions that you need to ask yourselves in terms of assumptions is, in the same way that we're having a debate about these things now, did the aliens also have a debate about messaging us, or just send one out? Daniela has already pointed out that we are a lot more cautious than we were in the 70s. So another question here is that message addressed to us, in which case it tells us more about the other cultures, or is it just something we've picked up on the side? Yep. So in terms of responding, how do we respond? We have difficulty understanding what's going on. That's fine. So I'm going to play you very quickly yet another cephalopod video. I'm really into cephalopods at the moment. And this is...
Watch what happens when one octopus attacks another. See the one coming forward? First, it makes itself taller, and it changes from camouflage to very dark. Those seem to be social signals. That octopus is saying, I'm big, I'm bad, and I'm going to take your spot. And that's a surprise, because octopuses are solitary, and there's very little evidence that they communicate with each other, or change color for any reason other than camouflage. US and Australian researchers captured a number of these aggressive interactions when they placed cameras on the seafloor near Tasmania. There are several signals that an octopus has that say, look out, here I come. How many they use at one time seems to be related to the intensity of the confrontation. They can make themselves look tall, turn very dark, climb on higher ground, and raise and spread their mantle. Most interactions are low-key and don't involve all these signals. Even for octopuses, sometimes discretion is the better part of valor.
Okay. So what we've just seen is a video about octopuses interacting. The assumption that I find in this particular video is that the researchers... sorry, can I... Is somebody talking? Do they have their mic on? Right. The assumption that I find in this video is that the researchers have assumed that these octopuses are being aggressive, but we don't know that. And over a period of time, over the last century, we have developed a number of ideas about how to interpret things. And rather regrettably, or in my case, enjoyably, Star Trek is a very good example of this. There's a universal translator. We can talk about Google Translate or ChatGPT and all sorts of large language models at some stage. But there are basic assumptions in the universal translator. All aliens are humanoid. But what if they're not? We can think about films like Arrival, Ted Chiang's story on which it's based. In the 60s in particular, Noam Chomsky assumed or taught us that there is a deep structure underlying language for all humans. That is open to discussion. In this particular, in modern times, we also assume that all life follows a Darwinian mechanism for evolution. We don't consider whether other forms of other mechanisms actually help evolve life. In the same way, again, thinking of Arrival as a film, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is used in that, where language apparently influences internal concepts, but this was developed by observing the language of the Hopi in North America, where there are examples of sentences or no sense of time used in it in the same way that, say, European languages do. But one thing we have to accept is that language being a means of communication, it must reflect external experiences in it, and we are attempting to describe and communicate those experiences between us. When we go back to the geopolitics of the system, we have to recognize that we are part of, in many cases, the United Nations. We're almost 200 countries in the world, but the United Nations only uses 6 languages as a lingua franca. But what if you don't speak Russian and can only understand English, as many Anglo-Saxons do? This is similar to the Star Trek Federation of Planets, which, however, I would like to point out is based on the United Nations. So there are various issues you can take from what has actually happened in the past over the last century or more. And that, to some extent, is the whole point of what is to come later. Now, when we try and work out how to respond to people, what to say, the first issue is, are we going to use the same language or means of communication as the extraterrestrial aliens? Well, on Earth, when you're talking to somebody else, you have a number of ways of doing so. And here is one. Now, the heading for this slide is Gavagai, which is something that was used by one of the 20th century linguists in the 1950s. He effectively describes what linguists over the last couple of millennia from different cultures have discussed in terms of how language is put together and how symbols can be or have to be assigned meaning. At the end of the day, the takeaway from this is symbols do have to be assigned meaning, but they are essentially arbitrary. And that arbitrary meaning is what we try to communicate. And we have different modes of communication. We have different media in which we communicate. Obviously, the modes of communication depend on our bodies: visual, tactile, smell, taste, all sorts of other things, gestures, as we've just seen. Right? But we also have to recognize that these depend as much on time as well as any sort of dynamic system that we're using. And we also need to recognize that any symbols that we're using in order to communicate with others is multimodal and multidimensional and can use many and different types of media. We asked earlier on, how do we know that this is a message? How did we receive the message? Well, our assumption at the moment is that the message we've received is electromagnetic in nature through radio telescopes. But what if they're using non-electromagnetic media? We can now, for example, detect gravitational waves from collisions of black holes, according to various research groups. Is it possible that gravitational waves may well be another method of sending messages? There's a whole set of issues around how we actually decide what these symbols are put together. Well, I've already mentioned gesture and the like. We've got a method of storing it, perhaps. We write things. When we look at a television screen, that's in 2 spatial and several temporal dimensions, which are sequential and scanning methods. Think about a hologram. If it's moving, it's providing a different sense of time and duration. So what we've got there is the basics of what we need to think about when we respond. So very quickly, what I'd like to know is, are there any other comments that people would like to make so far? Are there any questions they've got? But very short, very quickly, please.
Assuming there's some kind of pattern to the message, would it not be able to be reduced to a mathematical equation? And then
it can be reduced to all sorts of things. The whole point about the Gavagai approach is that because the assignment of meaning is arbitrary, they can use any number of ways of actually encoding it, which we then have to decipher. That's the decision we have to make when we respond. How are we going to encode our meaning? Okay.
Well, it seems like if the intention is communication, one would try to find the simplest means to initiate it. If you're going to overtly encode, complicate, encrypt a message, then what would be the point if you want to initiate communication? Unless you're attempting to perform some kind of test, an intellectual test or something, to see if the recipient is worthy of your communications. Otherwise, what's the point?
I would refer you back to an earlier slide where I include graffiti as a reason for communicating altogether. Is there any reason why people scratch their initials into the Colosseum, for example? Is that something they want to communicate? Is it actually aimed at somebody?
Well, it's attempting to say, I was here, or I exist. It's not an attempt at communication then. So then it's kind of pointless. I mean, would you respond to a graffiti?
Right. And
no.
So your assumption here in terms of whether what the communication is supposed to be saying is that they want to communicate something specific, right? That is an assumption. That's the whole idea behind this is we don't actually know what the reason for the communication is. We have just received a message and we've deciphered it. That's all we know.
Well, that's my point. If it's a means of communication, then it should be more readily interpretable. Otherwise, it's just, as you said, it's just like, I am here. Look, I'm here. I don't care if you respond or not. I'm just saying that I'm here. And so,
I will again refer you back to those different reasons for communicating or not, including dance, artwork, and so on and so forth. I'd like to go through to Dimitri, who's got the hand up. So would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead, please?
Yes, I would say from our practice on Earth, we know that people with high emotional intelligence are people who are good listeners. So we shouldn't try to respond immediately. We should try to listen as long as possible and fully understand what is in front of us. And I would say there is nothing more annoying than someone who is occupying the conversation and talking all the time. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Right. I'm now going to continue because we're going to run out of time otherwise. This is the very quick legal bit. How would you actually treat the stranger? When you do talk to somebody, how do you treat them? Are you aggressive? Are you friendly? Do you ignore them? All sorts of things like that. In the 1950s and 1960s, we put together the Outer Space Treaty, and the first lawyer who helped with that was Andrew Haley. He put together something called Metalaw. He based his ideas on a history on Earth of diseases, many of which originated in Europe as a result of colonization. There was warfare, there were resource exploration and the like. These are large issues that we're not going to go into, but which we'll come back to in a very short form in a short while. But in summary, I'd like to point out the connection here is that Star Trek's Prime Directive is based on Haley's Metalaw and the golden rule that he presented. And that is do unto others as they would wish to be treated. Right? This is similar to old ideas, old cultural ideas of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You want to be treated in a certain way, please say so. But here's the question about all those things. What are their intentions? What do they want? How do we determine them if they do not know how to communicate with us and if we do not understand what they are saying? We go back to theory of mind. We go back to what is our mode and means of communication and what we are responding to and what we're asked them to respond to in return. Similarly, as we go through again on Earth, when we meet up with different cultures, we tend to treat the ambassadors or the envoys from a different culture, if they are official, as diplomats and give them immunity. But that requires, in human terms, legal standing. And that is very much part of the system that was put in place in the 19th century, which we will come to in a moment, where you will find that many, many cultures, many humans on Earth themselves were not given legal standing. So again, I would just like to point out that a good way of understanding this is to actually watch Star Trek. And I'm aware that I do like Star Trek more than many other people, but there we are. Okay, so I've gone through a number of issues that need to be dealt with. So what has happened in the past on Earth? What sort of encounters have we had? And what can we learn from them in order to talk to aliens or entities from another planet or even another continent? Right, very quickly, I'm going to stop sharing and ask if anybody wants to put anything in the chat, or whether anybody wants to make a very quick comment. And I do mean quick, please.
I wanted to add, Kesh, that by the time there is a question and answer in the communication, civilization might have changed completely. As you said, the Earth, I mean, the civilization on Earth now in 2023 is very different from what we had 1,000 years ago. So it really depends also on the distances. We might send a reply by the time it reaches this other civilization. Their culture might have changed completely. So it is also that factor could be an interesting element to discuss, to at least think about.
That is a very good point, and it is something that particularly in the last few centuries or even last few millennia has been very apparent. It used to take 6 months to travel between Europe and India, for example. And a lot of things can happen in 6 months. It didn't just take 24 hours to get onto Concorde and fly across the Atlantic. Absolutely amazing in terms of the changes that can happen. So thank you for that. We are communicating, and I am going to now go through with the different examples that we can actually. So what have we learned over the last 500 years or 2,000 years or even 10,000 years? The first thing I'd like to point out is, remember I mentioned people need legal standing. Well, for the last few hundred years, we've had something known as the hierarchy of civilizations. And that continues to this day in terms of our responses. Do we need to be cautious? Should we be paranoid? Should we be friendly? Are they our equals or unequals? And this was placed in law in the 19th century with notions of the noble savage, but also taking the noble savage to one side and deciding that various populations in the Pacific and in Africa were not human, and therefore Europeans could take an appropriate territory and exploit resources without indigenous permission. Now, the question here is, when we look at civilizations which are extrasolar, are we essentially revisiting those same ideas? The Kardashev scale looks at energy use and scale in terms of planets, systems, galaxy-wide and the like. We also look at technosignatures, which we've already mentioned in our discussion, right? So we have a whole range of issues to consider when we've got contact between cultures. So here's some examples of contact between cultures over the millennia, some of them recent, some of them less so. If you were an ancient Greek and you saw somebody wearing trousers, you considered that was effeminate, for women only. So when they saw Persians wearing trousers or people from Central Asia riding horses, wearing trousers, they were considered to be non-human and also considered to be unmanly. What we have in a different culture, but also from Asia, is the exchange of knowledge between China and India. Many people will know the TV series called Monkey. That's based on a pilgrimage to collect texts from India to be used in China and Japan. That was around about 650 common of the Common Era. In the early 1500s, when the Spaniards went to Tenochtitlan, which is basically central Mexico, the capital thereof and the like, they were very impressed with the agricultural methods, the markets and the goods in those markets. They were incredibly impressed with the fact that the cities in Mexico were so clean environmentally and hygienically. And then we come to the later 300 years or so. Britain in particular decided to start a trade war with Native Americans in order to try and get land. So they sold them, they gave them blankets that were contaminated with smallpox. Sailors who visited Tahiti in the 1700s discovered that they could get sex in exchange for iron nails, which actually led to one of the ships that they were sailing on falling apart because they basically gave away so many nails. And we'll come to this in a moment, which is over the last few hundred years, there have been so many embassies to China and to Japan. And effectively, there has been a problem with resource appropriation in terms of conquest and the like. Now, if you want to take this further, if you want to read more about this, you might want to look at Laura Nader's book, What the Rest Think of the West. That is actually a very good way of finding out what travelers over the centuries thought of the countries that they visited in Europe and North America. So, some good, some bad here. This is contact between cultures on Earth. Is this what we would do to extraterrestrial entities? When Britain went to China in the late 1790s, this is the reply they got from the Chinese emperor. I'm going to read this out, not to all of it, but enough. I set no value on objects, strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. Our celestial empire possesses all things and lacks no product. I do not forget the lonely remoteness of your island, nor do I overlook your ignorance of our customs, the usages of our celestial empire. If you land anywhere in China, you will be expelled. You have been warned. Now, this is China telling the British where to go. If any communication we get from extraterrestrial aliens is similar, are we also going to say we don't want to know you because we have everything we need on Earth? Or are the Americans or the Chinese or the South Africans going to say the same thing? We don't want anything from you because we've got everything in our own country. We are already wonderful. Look at the way different cultures have actually been perceived. If you look at the 18th century, France's idea of what India was supposed to be very scientific, had a lot of other disciplines, geometry, chess derived from there. They had jurists, philosophers, and theologians. By the 21st century, they were basically considered to be religious or spiritual instead of scientific. They were considered to be superstitious, and they do nothing but perform rituals with multiple gods. Now, that is in complete contrast to what the 18th century Europeans thought of them. But despite this, and we go back to a couple of thousand years ago, and even just a couple of hundred years ago, both Imperial Persia, which had an empire as opposed to the ancient Greeks who only had 5 villages in the Peloponnese, took over Persian administration and politics in the same way Britain took over the Mughal Empire's administration and politics. And to this day, we are still using a lot of that. And this is basically what we got from going there, not them coming to us, right? So let's have a look at what happened before Europe decided to explore the rest of the world and start trading and the like. I've already mentioned contact between India and China. Well, India and Greece also had a lot of contact. A large part of this was the result of Buddhism. This was part of the civilizing mission, you might call it, or religious mission from around about 500 BCE to later. We have now got the modern symbol for zero. One of the largest universities that ever existed, survived until 1200 CE. We have a whole range of Indian philosophies that developed as a result of communication between India, China, India, and Greece over 2,000 years. We now have Neo-Confucianism. My favorite is the one that apparently samurai swords in Japan were made from Indian iron ore, which is something we think of samurai swords as being typically Japanese. And the Buddhists took over the saintly halo in their sculptures from the Greeks. There is a two-way communication here, a two-way exchange, which does not rely on what that initial message was. It depends on what we do after that initial message. As early as 2,000 years ago, there was trade between the Indians and the Sinhalese. Sinhalese meaning the country of Sri Lanka as it is known now. And there are many examples of this. The Chinese had already circumnavigated the Indian Ocean, but they didn't leave any local records. So is it possible they had no impact at all? All they were doing was gathering things to take back to China? We're not sure. There's research going on to establish that. We might find out at some stage. If we continue the question of contact between different cultures, when the Western European Crusaders went to the Holy Land, the Middle East, in order to whatever it was that the Crusaders wanted to do, the Muslims that they met thought that these Crusaders, these Christians, were basically just barbarians who had turned up in their own country for no reason whatsoever. So again, here is contact between cultures, which is difficult to establish. Yes, you can send an embassy saying, we're going to come and invade you. But what if the people that you send that message to are saying, yeah, well, come along, we'll give you lots of food or whatever. And when we actually go back to the period of contact between, say, the Arab cultures, the Muslims and India, around about the 10th century, we get what we now use in our modern cultures: Arabic numerals, heliocentricity, solar eclipses, decimalization, decimal placement, and so on. There's a whole range of things that come from contact between cultures. Once the Europeans came along, yes, there was territory that they took over. But what we mustn't forget is that there were alliances between people in, say, the Indian Ocean and the Europeans. Gujarat, for example, allied with Venice and actually went to war with Portugal. Not something many people know about. Different types of religion, different types of thinking, different cultures became apparent. And the most amazing thing is the foods that we eat. Chilies were introduced by the Portuguese from South America into India in 1503. And yet we think of chilies as being typically Indian. We use maize, potatoes, and tomatoes in all of our cuisines. This is what contact between cultures does for us. It is not always smallpox contaminated blankets, nor is it always wonderful and saintly halos. We need to look at what is happening in between and why this is being done. We have to remember that on the Isle of Hispaniola, people died from diseases that they did not know about, as in the rest of the Americas. But we should also recognize that the population of South America and to some extent North America was changed because of the slave trade. Now, the question is that a human catastrophe? Yes. But it can also be seen as economic in its form. And that is contact between cultures. Whatever happens after that first contact and that message, we have to recognize it has consequences. So finally, I would like to sort of end by pointing out that the exchange is definitely two-way, perhaps even multi-way. I've already mentioned administration and law using armies, the imperialism that happened, the methods of rule that the Greeks and the British took over as a result of their civilizing mission in their need to protect their resources and supply chains. But there are other impacts on Europe as well. I've already mentioned the foods. We would not have rubber tires if a Frenchman had not gone to South America, got trapped in the forest there, and seen the natives actually using the sap from rubber trees. It was whilst he was there that La Condamine also conceived of the metric system, which is now used by the rest of the world. This is part of the contact between cultures after that initial message comes through. We're not just looking at science. Art movements like Dadaism and Fauvism were the result of contact and knowledge that came to Europe from sub-Saharan Africa and its sculptures, and the Pacific cultures. And I've already mentioned simple little things from the Indian and Chinese cultures, such as the modern numerals, the zero, the decimal placement. And we think of Chinese noodles, or we think of Italian spaghetti. We're fairly certain that's where it comes from. We also look at things like electromagnetism, quantum mechanics, physics and complementarity principles or ideas in there. If you go back to the original writings by people like Einstein and Bohr, you will find that they often reference foreign cultures and concepts in order to try and understand what they were developing. And we have, through that, issues and influence over art movements like Surrealism and Cubism. So what I'd like to do there is end with this absolutely enormous tour around the Earth and point out that whatever we do after that initial contact, what we decide and how we go for it may provide us with consequences, may give us consequences that we're unaware of, but we would also need to recognize that many of these consequences are unintended. They may not be things that we can plan for. And with that, I would like to basically end, and I'll take questions and open up for discussion as you would like.
Thank you, Mukesh. This is so much interesting material, and I'm pleased that we have the recording so everyone can also watch the slides back and read all the text, all the content that you put together.
Okay, most of the comments I'm picking up appear to be more about the technology of communication than about contact between cultures. So how do we want to deal with this? Do we want to open the discussion up to technology? Or do we want to continue with the idea of contact between cultures?
Question
Anyone? Go, yeah.
Yeah, we have to recognize the contact. Apparently lately there's been over 240 incidents just got reported in news of unidentified aerial phenomenon, apparently flying all over the continent with no recognized technological expertise belonging to any particular country. Is that their method of saying, hi, folks, we're here?
I think the clue there is the use of the word unidentified or unexplained. We don't know what they are, so we can speculate endlessly. How far we want to take that speculation can go back to medieval scholastics. How many angels dance on the head of a pin? Yeah. At some stage, we have to recognize that we have a limited knowledge of what is going on. And therefore, we have to proceed with a set of assumptions in some manner, whether it is to not communicate, whether it is to assume that these UAPs are from alien civilizations or from countries on Earth which are technologically different or advanced. I'm not necessarily thinking advanced because in many ways, many of the countries on Earth have access to the same technologies. They've just gone in different directions. So where do we go from there? What sort of assumptions do we need to make in order to continue contact? And are we actually ready for the unintended consequences of any contact? And I think that's the root of my question for this particular sort of webinar. It's not so much about whether we can understand aliens and how we communicate with them, because those end up being technological or sort of quasi-scientific in the sense of we need to understand their psychology, perhaps, theory of mind, and so on, which is why I introduced all of this. But at the end of the day, these are the issues at the back of what we actually end up doing. What are actions going to be in response? And do we like what we've done so far? Sorry, that's...
There was a question. Lindsay, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I was thinking, you know, like if we did, you know, just going past like the technological use of, you know, deciphering a message or even receiving a message. I don't know, I don't know, I feel like we could assume that, you know, both parties don't understand each other, but we can assume that both parties want to communicate with each other. I don't know, I think that would be something that both sides would have in common. But also, if we look at the history of human civilization, we see that, you know, like colonization, conquest was based on the idea that, you know, one culture or society was superior to another. And so I just want to think that, like, you know, we would go forward with communicating with extraterrestrials by not repeating our mistakes. That's all.
It's a good point. The question, I think somebody in the chat mentioned politics and science. Could I ask what you think about the politics and where you think that comes from, in effect? Because who is it who decides what is good or bad in terms of consequences?
Well, if one is to believe any of the, if one is even to ascribe any degree of truth to the so-called testimony that occurred yesterday to the U.S. Congress, we have the government has already captured unidentified objects, or, well, according to, then they would be identified since they have them, and even alien, biological. So is that what we should expect from the interaction of politics, even if this isn't real, but in a future scenario? If that's occurring currently, then that's a total overwhelming impact of politics on the whole question.
Okay, can I again bring the what you've just said goes back to the question of assumptions that I started with. What are the assumptions that you're making in terms of what Congress has said in the US Congress about these phenomena? And will another country such as, I don't know, Vietnam agree with those conclusions? When we respond to a message from outside Earth, one of the questions that I asked earlier on was, who is it that responds for Earth? And how do we respond. And so when we actually then come back to it, if one country makes a decision to say, yes, we'll talk to them, and then another one says, no, we don't want to talk to them, there will still be consequences, because one country will accept direct contact and the other country won't. And there will be spillover between countries as well, as we see from human history over the last few hundred years. Yeah, I'd like to move away from the unidentified aerial phenomena, because we don't actually know what those are. And the whole issue here is, how do we want to deal with contact between cultures, not whether we actually accept whether aliens exist or not. That is a theoretical question that I believe has been addressed in earlier workshops in this series.
Dimitri, you have a question? Could you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yes, I have a comment. First, I want to thank Mukesh for the excellent presentation. I would like to have a time to look at the slides, because this was all very condensed. My comment is that this discussion so far has been a little bit too generic, and I want to be a little bit more specific and to turn our attention to the fact that such contacts should actually provide only gradual access to information. Why? Because imagine we give atomic bombs to monkeys. What will happen is probably something catastrophic. So I envision such communication to have levels of data and knowledge, and these, I'll call them entrance levels. In order to access them, they will require successfully passing an entrance exam. So what we need in the first place in such communication is establishing something like a common inter-civilization university and exchange of knowledge. And you cannot have a lawyer if this person hasn't passed all 5 courses and taken exams, etc. This absolutely is the same in the case of communication with other civilizations, maybe even more. That's all that I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. That is actually a very good point. I believe we've got a couple more people. Bandit Queen, you've had your hand up for some time.
Hi, yes. Thank you, first of all, for a marvellous workshop. I really enjoyed that. My thoughts are, what if we're assuming that they are interested in us? I was thinking back to what you were saying about the Chinese when they told people to go away. What if their message is, please go away and leave us alone, we're not interested? We should respect. I think our first thing of communication should be respect mutually. And I was just also going to ask, aren't we doing the same today with other cultures when we try to enforce democracy where people don't want democracy? Should we not be respecting what they want and learning from the past? I think we are making the same mistakes as we have done in history when we criticize another country's philosophy, for example, just because we don't agree with it. And I'm thinking, in the case of first contact, if you don't have any of that respect, the results could be catastrophic.
Again, some very good points, and to a greater or lesser extent, I agree with you. It cuts right to the heart of Haley's Metalaw. How do we determine how they wish to be treated?
Yeah.
How, for example, does Daniela know how I want to be treated if I can't tell her?
Yeah.
And this is very much a difficulty. And of course, there is what you've already mentioned, the notion or the question of what if the person who is sort of sending out the message is saying, stay away.
Mm.
But equally on the other side, what if the person is saying, please contact us, we would like help?
Mm. Yeah.
Similarly, are we, and this is effectively a political or even an ideological question, are we imposing values from different countries onto other countries?
Yeah.
I'm aware within the space industry, for example, that the United States has very clearly stated that it does not wish to work with China.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, an American general said, we can't work with China, we won't work with China because their values are not our values. I was a bit taken aback by that, given that we're all humans on the same planet. So,
Yeah. I think
thank you. Yeah.
we could learn so much from each other, most probably.
Right. Next person, I believe, is Utsav.
Yes, my question is that how history enters in science.
How does history enter science? At the end of the day, everything that science does has happened in history. So the fact that Einstein came up with the special theory of relativity happened in 1905, which is over 100 years ago. Or if we go through to people like Newton, that happened 400 years ago. So that is all history. And what we have to recognize is that as far as that science is concerned, much of the time that science is a product of that period. So what we do in science now is a result of our place in history in the 21st century. Yeah. Does that make sense?
So how it is connected with the cultural things of different countries in ancient times.
Right. The problem there is that is a very big question. But what one of the things to look at is to look at where ideas come from. So the symbol for zero was invented in, I believe, in Central Asia and Northern India. But the concept of zero was the result of interaction between the Chinese and Indians in Southeast Asia as a result of trade. So one happened about 3,000 years ago. The trade happened about 2,000 years later, 2,000 years ago instead. So these things change. And when you look at the different cultures, you also, and this will be something that you might want to look at, is if you look at the Arab or Muslim cultures, they did a lot of science between 700 AD and 1400 AD, which has become the basis of our modern science. And this is a very good and interesting area if you want to actually work out the relationship between science in history and science as it is now. Yeah, but it's a very big topic, so I'd like to unfortunately move on from that, but by all means contact me and I can give you more information. We are continuing to have questions and comments in the chat, which effectively are talking about governments, the representation that scientists can bring to governments and decision making. And as Dimitri has said, there's a lot of information condensed in this presentation. So we're not really able to answer these questions. And what I presented is meant for discussion. As I think I said right at the beginning, there's no such thing as a right answer or a wrong answer, because that will depend on what happens as time goes on and whatever consequences we like in future or otherwise. Right. Daniela, we've now reached an hour and a quarter. Do we want to end?
That's fine, Mukesh. I think we also exceeded the time, and it's great to see that there is so much interest in this debate. And as you said, it's more about opening these questions. So for me, what is really interesting about SETI is that it really prepares humans for a possible contact with another civilizations by asking all these questions. These questions are not trivial at all. This way of thinking is not superficial. It's not something we can give for granted. So having these discussions really helps to have a more prepared mindset in case we have a contact. So
Absolutely.
thank you for your great talk, Mukesh. And we all see each other at another workshop in the near future. We are organizing more events like this. So thank you for your participation. Thank you, Mukesh, again, for being a great collaborator. And I'll see you all soon.
Right. Thank you, everyone, to all the participants, to SETI Institute, and especially to you, Daniela. Absolutely love the opportunity. I hope I haven't made anything worse, but I hope I've managed to open up an interesting discussion. And I will be there. We'll talk again soon. All right. Take care.